Welcome to the channel. If you're watching this, you have joined the Storygeeks YouTube channel. And this little quick introduction to the video is necessary because it would be kind of confusing if I didn't say a little something up front here. I'm Jeff Lyons, founder of Storygeeks.com, and the creator of a new class that I'm now promoting, which this video is an excerpt from, called Build Your Book, which is a class developed for novelists and memoirists or creative nonfiction writers to help them get from story development to writing actual pages, where we actually build people's books. And it's got 6 modules and lots of videos and like 5+ hours of video instruction, lots of worksheets. You know me and worksheets. I love worksheets. But I want to give you just a heads up about where this weird module 2 thing fits into all of this. This is part of the second module in that class. And I pulled it out and put it here on YouTube because it talks about a very important issue, which I haven't talked about before here on the channel, which is something I call commercial narrative pace for fiction and creative nonfiction, and how pacing is influenced by chapter design, because Build Your Book is all about building chapters and building chapter scenes to get you into a position to actually start writing pages of your manuscript. But this discussion of what is pacing and how does it work with word count and chapter design and numbers of chapters and how do all those pieces fit together, it felt very much like a standalone topic that needed to be dealt with for its own right. So I pulled it out and I'm plopping it in here so that you can benefit from this piece of the class, which goes into a whole lot more material about chapter building, scene building, what scenes, what constitutes scenes, and so on. We're not going to get into all that here, but we are going to talk about what is narrative pace, why it is important, what actually builds and creates narrative pace, and how it all fits together with the nuts and the bolts of word count of books and chapters and all that, the business of the business kind of a thing. So welcome, and we'll just jump right in. Welcome to Module 2, Building and Breaking Out Chapters. So in this module, you're actually going to start building your book. You've been through all the self-assessments, whether it was successful or a challenge, you've been through it. You are now ready to start building your book. But before we start building your book, I want to make sure that you understand some core concepts about how chapters work, why chapters are chapters, how many do you need, how do I know how many do you need, how can you know how many do you need, what's in a chapter, all the nuts and the bolts of chapter design, okay? But the other part of it is you have to understand a little bit about what this thing is called narrative pace, what I call commercial pace. After looking at thousands of books and stories that I've come through the class and that I've also read, I have come to some conclusions about how books are paced in the market today. And they're all over the map. Obviously, there's no rule out there about it. But generally speaking, agents, editors, lit managers, and so on want things that move quickly or that have a pace to them that's relentless, that there's a real clear forward momentum and there's tension, and that's all part of pacing, okay? Some books are very slow in plotting, and that they're designed to be that way. They're more about the lazy read, or getting into the subtleties of the subtext, and all of those are going to be much slower reads. Pacing is basically the speed of the read. That's kind of how it's defined. And the consensus has a very particular way it describes narrative pace. They do it at a very high level. Again, not bad, not wrong, but I don't think particularly useful in terms of teaching you how you need to think about approaching it for your book. They'll talk about this, a lot of the same things I talk about. Word choices, so dialogue is really important, and plot. You got to have a great plot. They'll say it in those kinds of general terms that don't really tell you anything important. They're all sort of, kind of obvious responses to the question, what's pace? Well, you got to have good dialogue. You got to have a good plot. You got to, yeah. There's a lot more to it than that. A lot more nuance to it than that. And we're going to go through that at a very high level here because this isn't a full pacing class. But I have a book, obviously, don't I always, called Rapid Story Development ebook number 1, Commercial Pace, where I go into much more detail about the issue of narrative pace and how to use it, how to work with irony, narrative drive. I do diagnostics on slow paces, on fast paces, and how to fix both and all that. There's a lot more going on in that ebook that we're going to talk about here. But this will give you a beginning understanding of what narrative pace is about and what you need to start looking for, because as you build your chapters, you're also going to be inadvertently building the pace of your book, which is absolutely, pace makes or breaks a read. So this is a very, very important concept. So we're going to talk about two things first: pace, and then chapters themselves. What are chapters? How many do you need? What are the nuts and the bolts in the industry in the publishing industry about how chapters are used and how what's expected of you by the agents? We're going to get into all of that, word count, all that kind of stuff, because the nuts and the bolts of chapter design and pace are like this. You've got to understand these two ideas and how they work together in order to implement it effectively on your side as the writer. So this particular section of Module 2 is all lecture. Okay, there's no worksheets. This is just informational. I've got 2 PowerPoints I'm going to show you. They're very short. And I'm not going to go through all the bullets on all the slides, because you can just stop the video and read the slides for yourself. But I will have things to say about each of the slides that I think are important to add to the content of what's on the actual slides. So first, a little bit of lecture, and then the next section will actually be the chapter design, the grid design worksheet that you will use to actually start building out your chapters. And we're going to go through that whole worksheet, talk about how you do it, what's in it, what to avoid, et cetera, like any other worksheet. Okay? So let's talk a bit about pacing. For me, there's 4 basic foundation stones, I call them: writing style, manuscript design, chapter design, and narrative drive. We're going to look at each of these separately here to understand them a little bit about how they all work together. When they're all present and accounted for, and in some semblance of balance or harmony, you're going to hit commercial pace for your book. Every book's got its own natural pace. Every book, every story. And part of the challenge for you is to find out what that is. And it starts with writing style. It's very subjective, but very important. And it's constituted basically by these 5 pieces: language, rhetoric, word choice, sentence structure, paragraph structure. Language is language. I make a distinction in the narrative of a premise line between storytelling and writing. Language isn't writing. Language is just language. It's a form of communication. Any system of symbols used in communication. There's no strategy, there's no agenda, it's just other than communicating. That's language. Language has a rhythm. Language has musicality. Language has cadence. Has rules of grammar, that sort of thing. That's all about language. And then rhetoric is language with a purpose. How effective is your language? How persuasive is your writing? That's rhetoric. And there are best practices for rhetoric in prose writing. Yeah, there are rules, I guess, but more than not, there's best practices. And writing style is you finding your use of language. How are you going to leverage language? Especially if you're working on very genre-specific stuff like a horror story. You want to use horror language. That's your agenda. That's effective communication. You don't want to write a horror story like it's a love story, even if it is a love story in the horror genre. You don't want it to have a different genre tone because of the word choices you're making. That's where word choices come in. That's the other part of writing style. Are you Ernest Hemingway and you're very short, curt with your sentence structure? Are you William Faulkner, who writes sentences that are 1,288 words long? I think the longest sentence in prose writing is like almost 4,000 words without punctuation or with punctuation. There's an entire book that was written by a Czech writer where it's all just one sentence. That sentence structure, that's language and rhetoric working together to an effect. Now, is it effective? Is it an effective effect? I don't know. You have to make that decision yourself. But that's what we're talking about here. And then paragraph structure. You going with just bullet paragraphs, just one line guys, or you going for really long paragraphs. That all is fast read versus slow read. The more you have, the more it takes to get through it. That's writing style. That's one of the foundations. But this is where most people focus in the consensus, with the world out there and the creative writing world. They're worried about word choices, sentences, the speed of those, and how those are constructed. And that's really where most of the focus goes. Even with dialogue, it's what are your word choices, that sort of thing. There's more to it than that. It's more nuanced than that. Then we have the next piece, which is manuscript design, effects, pacing, the number of words on the page, the number of pages per chapter, overall chapters for the book, overall page count for the book. Those are all fundamental questions you've got to think about, especially as a first-time writer. You've got to have your word counts right. You can't hand an agent a 200,000 word first novel. They're going to put you in the round file, even if it's a great book. They don't know it's a great book. They're not going to read it, probably. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. People have done this. They've written very, very long first novels, and they've been hits. But when you look at even J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, the very first book in the series was, I think, the shortest book in the series. They didn't get bigger books until she was a hit. The first book was probably within the right word count for the genre. So she was very careful about that. Or the editor anywhere at the publishing house at Scholastic made it sure that it was in the right word count, that they knew they could print economically and get the job done. And then when she was a big hit, okay, well, go ahead, write some more. And she did. So you want to look at these factors. The standard word count per page for you as a writer writing your initial manuscript is 250 words per page, double spaced, Times Roman, 1-inch margins. That's what you're going for. 250 words per page. Now, how many numbers of pages per chapter? In my ebook, Commercial Pace, RSD ebook number 1, I go through some examples of these. Okay. It gets a little dicey here. It's difficult because there are people all over the map with the number of pages in a chapter. What I have found is that there is a general rule not a rule, but a best practice that most commercial genre fiction are anywhere between 8 and 15 pages for a chapter. So you're looking anywhere from, 37 chapters to 50 chapters, more or less, for a book. If you're James Patterson, who's, a very famous thriller writer, you've got 1.5 to 2 pages per chapter, because he writes one scene is one chapter. And he's got 175 chapters in his books. And he cries all the way to the bank. So, he breaks his rule all the time, all day long. And he's very successful at it. He writes very cinematically that way, thinks very cinematically that way. An effective approach if you can do it that way. One scene chapters, okay. As long as you set that expectation up at the beginning of the story and you don't suddenly throw a 25-page chapter at somebody, they're not going to be upset with it, because they will then be acclimated to the style. That's part of a writing style too. But these manuscript numbers matter. We're going to go into these when we look at the chapter details about the nuts and the bolts of chapter design. Okay, so that's chapters. That's manuscript. Then we come down to chapters. Now, I'm not going to break out the definitions for each of these things here. We're going to do this later when we get into chapters and scenes. I'm going to break out all these pieces by definitions. But chapters are made up of these pieces. Story beats, and I'll talk about what a beat is. Scenes, I'll talk about what a scene is. Sequences of scenes, which are combinations of 3 or more scenes, all leading to story structure milestones, which is what we talked about in the classic story self-assessment part in the earlier module, when we talk about inciting incident, midpoint, do moment, etc. Those are all story structure milestones. All your chapters are leading up to these milestones. And chapters are designed in a very particular way, as we're going to see. And these are the component parts of what those chapters are. And then we have narrative design as the fourth piece. Narrative drive. Narrative drive, there's a whole section in ebook number 1 where I talk about narrative drive in much more detail. But this is essentially what it means. It's the quality of the piece of writing that impels you to keep going. What does it drive you forward? Does the story move forward? It's a combination of tension, irony, a sense of forward momentum that is unrelenting, clear stakes that are building. Those are all part of narrative drive. And it's also a critical foundation stone for your pacing. If you have weak drive, the pacing is going to feel really sluggish. Maybe you want that. Okay. All right. Not a problem. Just, again, remember I talk about conscious writer. Know what you're writing, know why you're writing it, know what you want to do. Be conscious about your process. So commercial pace is when all these things are working together. Okay? Very, very important. These are ideas and concepts and factoids that work in the market today that you need to be aware of. So, generally speaking, most commercial books, whether they're memoirs can be a little longer, or a little shorter rather, or genre fiction, you're looking at 20 to 40 chapters. Chapters have a tendency to be anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 words, a little shorter for memoir chapters. That's the tendency. That's the best practice. Can you go over or under? Sure. But this is kind of, it's nice to know what you're shooting for. 20 to 40 chapters. 20 is on the short side. Okay. So you can calculate, what that means in terms of word count per chapter, just by dividing the numbers out and figuring that out. As to word count, novels have a tendency to go from 70,000 overall to about 100,000 if they're really heavily genre dependent, and memoirs on the shorter side, 60 to 90. As I've said elsewhere, I think in this class, listening to a lot of agents talking about this, they're really clear that there's a sweet spot for them, for first-time novelists especially, between 85 and 95,000 words. If you hit that, then they have a high degree of confidence you know what you're doing. If you bring them a fantasy novel, that's part one of a 3-part book series, and it's 55,000 words, they're going to pass, because that's not what is right for the genre. They're going to want to see that sweet spot. And maybe if they really are in love with your idea, they might say, okay, I'll work with you and to get the page count up. It's easier to cut than it is to add. It's going to be a lot of work on their part to work with you to get this where they need it, if it's way below. So it's easier for them just to go, thank you, appreciate your query, but moving on. That's what's going to probably happen. So these are very high level what you're shooting for, okay? Now, how many chapters should you think about having in your book, just generally starting out, okay? This document here, this little slide here, kind of breaks it out by genre of what's typical at this point in the market in terms of what people are expecting. Obviously, chapter counts are going to vary based on overall word count and based on the pace. Longer paced stories are going to have longer chapters. Maybe you'll end up with 25 or 35 chapters, but maybe rather than 8 to 15 pages, you've got 20 to 25 or 30 pages per chapter. There are books out there like that. Just know you're going to have a pacing issue if it's not just crazy, relentless and mayhem going on to hold the reader's attention. You're really pushing it. I will guarantee you're going to get asked by the editor, let's cut these chapters in half. It's going to happen. But when you're going through this, this is what you want to look at. Oh, there's a little error there under literary fiction that should say denser chapters sometimes in nonlinear. Okay, not nonlinear literary fiction, although there are those out there too. Okay, so these are kind of what you're going for, genre specific. The romance one also has a little error there on that slide. It should be often structured around turning points and emotional shifts. That's the note. So my bad there. And now this is a general, I really found these to be accurate in terms of all the agents I've talked to, all the editors I've talked to, and what I've heard and researched online, that these are the recommended word counts for, again, first-time novelists or people without major track records in the publishing industry. If you're writing in these genres, you want to shoot for these numbers. I think literary fiction, romantasy, and all the others, those are a little over the top. I think those are a little high. You might get away with 100,000, but 150, 130, that's a pipe dream. Maybe on a second or third book, yeah, you could pull that off. But you notice how most of these are really close or in that sweet spot I talked about. 80,000 to 85 to 95,000 words. Then you're in pretty safe territory. Okay, so you can go back and kind of massage this in your head and think about, what it looks like. And these are just some general notes on genres in general that you want to keep in mind while you're writing. You can go back and check out this slide on your own. Okay, so these are the considerations for pacing and for how chapters work, how word count works, why they're important, and what you're kind of shooting for in the grand scheme. Okay, because as you move through creating your chapters, you will be, as I said, inadvertently setting a certain pacing for your writing. The chapters are going to give you a feeling of momentum, forward motion, rising tension and stakes, and you're going to see where the dead spots are. That's usually where you need something going in there from a subplot level, or maybe your A-line plot level. You need some more connective tissue there, creating and adding to that momentum or dramatic tension. So you are working on pace, even as you're working on general chapter design and implementation. You will have pacing considerations squeezing in there and getting in the way. But with these ideas and numbers that I've just given you floating around in your head, you'll have a context within which to appreciate that squeezing in. Okay. It won't be a surprise. You'll say, oh, yeah, now I know now I've got a sense of what's going on here. So where am I going to shore this up? Is my word count in the chapter, do I have too much going on? Is my language choices inappropriate for the genre? Are my sentences too long? Start looking at things that you can use to respond to the speed of the read as you're designing these things, because you can anticipate what the read's going to be by how compelling the pieces of the chapter are that you're designing. And we're going to look at that in the next section. It'll get very, very specific in terms of how you're building and what elements you're using structurally to build each chapter. Chapter building is not willy-nilly. It's not, let's cross our fingers and toes. It's not, let's see what the muse wants from me. No, you're the writer. You choose. You are in control, not controlling, never controlling, because you can't control anything. You are in control. Very different energy, very different idea, very different process. You want to be in control of your design process, not controlling of it. Okay? That's why it's important that you really settle in and think about what you've heard in this section of this module, because it'll help you in the next one. And I will see you over there.